Hello, I'm Sherwood Lingenfelter, Professor of Intercultural Studies at Fuller Theological Seminary and author of the textbook for this course, Ministering Cross-Culturally. My purpose in this brief lecture today is to discuss with you a little controversy that has emerged in theological circles about the notion of incarnational ministry. This was made very explicit recently at a lecture at Fuller Theological Seminary in February of 2011 by Professor Todd J. Billings of Western Theological Seminary, who is a graduate of Fuller. Dr. Billings presented a lecture to the Fuller community at that time entitled Ministry in Union with Christ, a Constructive Critique of Incarnational Ministry. Dr. Billings in that lecture proposed that the language of incarnation would be better replaced with the more biblical, faithful, and theological dynamic language of ministry as participation with Christ. I'm going to share with you briefly a summary of the lecture that Billings gave that was done on a website that I'll give you reference to in the written materials with this lecture. I'm quoting now from the website Eric Landry's short overview of that lecture. Billings shared how during his years at a Christian college, he learned that his job in relating to another culture was to be incarnate in that culture. However, as he spent a few years serving in Uganda and Ethiopia, he began to question the possibility of becoming incarnate in a culture, as well as the strategy's underlying assumptions. Billings wondered, am I assuming my own presence is redemptive in such a model? Billings goes on to suggest, incarnational ministry tends to conflate the unique incarnation with our process of learning a culture, framing the incarnate Christ as an example of coming to a new culture prepared to learn from and identify totally with the ones he came to reach. Billings remarked, Jesus was not, in fact, the model anthropologist, and did not go home every evening to compile field notes on that day's observations of the first century Jewish people. Quote, the deity is not a culture because God is not a creature, end of quote. So we cannot imitate the incarnation, but it is because it is not a human act, but a divine act, something only God can do. We must remember that Christ's mission is not identical to ours. He was redemptive, while we can only bear witness to redemption. Billings concluded, the power in the incarnation is precisely in its uniqueness. Now, Billings' critique of this common missiological theme is appropriate and helpful. I agree with his point that the incarnation is a divine act, something only God can do, and that the power in the incarnation is precisely in its uniqueness. As I've read back through my own work, I would no longer write the phrase on page 25, quote, if we are to follow the example of Christ, we must aim at incarnation. To state that we ought to aim at incarnation is clearly sloppy language and gives people poor direction for ministry. I have never imagined that humans could become fully incarnate in any other culture, as Jesus, holy God, became fully human in our world. In fact, my metaphor of becoming 150% persons makes that very clear. We can never achieve full identification with people of cultural origins different from our own. At the same time, I continue to be moved by the power of the metaphor of how Jesus came into our world and became one of us. I find it particularly compelling as presented in the book of Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. The Apostle Paul pleads with new believers in Philippi to have the same attitude of mind Christ Jesus had. He then unpacks that thought, saying, quote, who being in very nature God, made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. As a human being, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. From my point of view, we can imitate the attitude of Christ. If we embrace this as God's metaphor for our lives as followers of Jesus, we will learn first to not cling to our self-centered ways, and second, to take on the very nature of a servant among the people and ministry to which God calls us. Professor Billings chooses to call this ministry in union with Christ. As long as he uses the Philippians text as Paul did to describe this union, and then teaches us to let go of our cultural biases and to add to our repertoire the servant values and practices of those we serve, then he and I have no disagreement. Thank you very much.